Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. Today is October 21st. I'm Timothy Clancy, your chief mulleteer, or mulleteerisha, as what was the pun? There was a really good pun in here that I'll want to capture later. But joined by Bonky, the emotional support donkey. And this, if it seems a little haphazard, this is the last InfoMullet before the presidential election. So it's kind of, there's a lot of things we could talk about and a lot of juggling of issues and trying to capture what's going on currently, what's of interest. And before we get into it, if you haven't yet, like, follow, share the InfoMullet. Go ahead and share this video out. We're going to be talking about a mix of economic, coronavirus, national security, and my forecast for what happens after the election. Also, if you haven't yet, take a look at our Patreon site, become a mulleteer subscriber. It's only $5 a month. We do have server fees related to this. We have legal fees, believe it or not. We have some fees that we're doing that the Patreon support definitely helps us continue both the InfoMullet Live Ask Me Anything, but some of our longer length series articles, which we're doing one right now on the blog if you want to check that out. And we'll continue to do that. And your Patreon support kind of helps make that possible. Plus, I think it really helps bring some more context to the news today, as opposed to a lot of the soundbite and quick hits that we see. We try and get a little more context. So again, it's www.patreon.com/infomullet. $5 a month for a Patreon subscriber. Really appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and jump in here. But the topics for today, the way I kind of narrow down, like I said, one of the challenges I've had in this last month is I only do 2 InfoMullet Live Ask Me Anything a month. And, you know, I knew with November 3rd coming up at the presidential election, there's only 2 Ask Me Anything left. And how do I go about balancing these 2 very real things that people want to know about? The presidential election, obviously, and the issues related to that, without retreading everything else that you already see going on. You know, I don't want to remind you of your voter registration status like Facebook does every time we get on. But, you know, there's some good issues there. And then also with the coronavirus, because the pandemic is still very real, it's very present, and balancing these has been a challenge. So what I did last night is when I began preparing for this is I went out to the latest Gallup poll. And Gallup is one of the very credible polling organizations, and they poll every year the top issues that voters are concerned about in the presidential election. And the top 3 very clearly were the economy, the coronavirus response, and national security and terrorism. So I'm going to frame this last InfoMullet that, but I'm going to put my spin on it because I describe myself as a cynical optimist. That's my viewpoint on life. That's my viewpoint on politics. And we're going to have a little contest today for each of those topics. You get to guess whether I'm cynical about what happens after the election or an optimist. So the framing of this episode is we're going to go through the economy, coronavirus response, national security, and terrorism with an eye of what happens after November 3rd. What does the forecast look like as we're moving past this presidential election? And you get to guess ahead of time whether I'm cynical or optimistic on each of those topics. So thanks everyone for joining as well. Hope you're having a good day and staying indoors. Let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're talking about today is the economy. Or actually, let's jump into the coronavirus. The economy was actually obviously #1 for the American voters. That's often how it is, the economy. But I think the economy and coronavirus are so closely tied together that I wanted to start with where we're at within the US and globally. And I think it's become even more prevalent. There's been some interesting developments, not really great developments in the last couple of weeks since I did this at the beginning of the month. And if you haven't already guessed, I'm cynical about the coronavirus. I think I've been cynical since probably about mid-March. Mid to late March, I got very cynical very fast. And I remain cynical. And it's that, you know, this continues to be, if I were to describe the 21st century, I mentioned this in a blog back in March, everything that's happened in the 21st century up to March of 2020 was a footnote to the coronavirus. So 9/11, the Iraq War, the global war on terror, the great financial recession, these were all a footnote to the pandemic of 2020. And now I want to go further and say everything that's happened in 2020 up to this point right now is a footnote for the wave that's coming towards us, this wave 2 that's manifesting not just in the United States, but around the world. If you go back and you look at the Spanish flu, as a lot of people have, there's a huge number of fatalities. But if you go and look at it, there was this first wave, which was actually, we're like, well, that wasn't too bad. It's the second wave that hit them. Well, it looks like we're gearing up, and there are a few silver rays here. I don't want to be completely negative. I'm cynical, but it looks like we're gearing up for a very heavy second wave across the board. And the question's going to be, what's this going to do to our health, our mortality, survivors, things like that, but also to the economy. And that gets us into the economic discussion. So again, the American voters are more concerned about the economy, but I'm going to start with the coronavirus because it provides a very important context. And one of the first things to do is a lot of times when we talk about individual responses, we lose sight of where countries are overall. And it's important to understand that not all countries are suffering equally because the pandemic responses really matter. And there was some good research that came out that actually was posted by Lucas Hill on Science Decoded. If you haven't checked out his Facebook page, Science Decoded, Lucas Hill is doing a fantastic job getting really down into the weeds and the details on the scientific data around coronavirus. He's looking at blood types and correlations. He's looking at genetic mutations. He's diving into the vaccine research. He's really, he's a lab scientist, so he's working on this from that angle, and he provides it. But I want to share, this data came out in a published research. There we go. And what it does is it breaks the OECD countries, so to speak, some of the top economically developed countries, but it breaks them into low, moderate, and high mortality countries. And this is important when you start comparing countries to understand that they're in these strata. And low mortality are ones who have done the best responses. Moderate are, okay, they're not doing too bad. And high mortality, if you're in the high mortality countries, you can't claim you're doing well. You can claim you're relatively good amongst all the ones that are failing, but high mortality is high mortality. And just to clear the chart, it's a busy chart. Hopefully it's coming through clear on the Facebook broadcast. If not, we're recording this. We'll get it up on YouTube. It shows the date that the COVID-19 cases surpassed 1 million. And what's interesting, one per million, excuse me, it's a per capita, 1 per million. So you can see here, these are all now rationalized to the same penetration in a population, 1 per million. And you can see the dates actually generally range from early February with South Korea into about early March. So each strata has its own. Then as you go left to right, it says the COVID-19 deaths per 100,000. And this is important. What they do is they segment it in 3 sections. They say since the start of the pandemic, that's all deaths since its very beginning. But that includes a lot of what we didn't know about the novel parts of the coronavirus. And then it does the deaths since May 10th, which was after that first big wave. Wave 1, pretty much, except in the US, pretty much ended, and a few other countries. The wave 1 hit Europe, mainland Europe, and had peaked and crested and fallen by May 10th. Then since June 7th. So you've got 3 segments, and generally the story here is that mortality is shifting down as we learn more about how to treat it, how to identify it, how to keep people alive who do have it. I was on the very early end of this. I was in April when we didn't know a whole lot. I was in isolation. The methods we have are much better. I want to be clear, though, that these are mitigation methods. These aren't cures. These aren't remedies. There's no magical pill yet that says, you got this, you're safe. But you can see these deaths per capita. And as you go down, and then over here on the right is the excess of US COVID deaths since the start. I'm not going to get into that too much. I want to focus in this middle part here, these 3 columns. You can go to the link for the article if you want to read the rest of it. But you can really see how these 3 strata of country-style responses, and you can kind of get a feeling, this low mortality, South Korea and Japan used a pandemic panopticon response. Australia was hammer and dance. The moderate mortality generally used the hammer and dance for the most part. And then the high mortality, a lot of these ones began with induced herd immunity and then switched to hammer and the dance. Or in the case of the US, we began with a voluntary fire break and then switched to thoughts and prayers. And you've also got Sweden in there, which started with induced herd immunity, stayed with induced herd immunity, is now switching to voluntary fire break. We're going to get into that in a second. But you can see the very big difference here in every segment. And this is why it's important. Countries, the overall rate of fatality across is very telling. But if you look at since May 10th, you say, okay, no one knew what was going on. It was all new. It was novel. it still breaks out very tellingly that the high mortality countries are still struggling. And a lot of it is this lingering inability to come to grips with what's necessary to stem the pandemic. So you see here in the moderate countries, they dropped mortality very significantly down, often from single digits down to low digits. Israel is a little bit different in that it's one of the outliers that it hasn't really been able to drop it that much. They've got an active outbreak there right now. Best wishes to the muleteers who are dealing with that. But in the high mortality, even though in many cases they dropped it down, where it dropped down the most significantly is where countries adopted the hammer and the dance. Where they didn't, it stayed high. And you can see here, for example, Netherlands, I've used the Netherlands, they started out with induced herd immunity, very similar to Sweden, got punished for it. They adopted a hammer and a dance. You can see in these second and later segments, their mortality per capita has dropped off. Sweden, to its credit, has dropped off, but its mortality since June 7th is still higher than the mortality of anyone in the low mortality bracket at any point, or than most of the ones at the intermediate point. So this really shows that when you're comparing countries, if you want to compare best in breed pandemic responses, look at the low mortality countries or the moderate ones at the second or third segment. Don't go comparing Sweden to United Kingdom or things like that, because it's really not a good comparison. The United Kingdom has botched its response over and over again. And so this chart goes a long way to sort of helping us understand where these countries fall in from an overall pandemic response. So let me pull here. This is now looking at the specific countries we have looked at in the past. This kind of clearly shows this wave 2 arriving and what it means consequence-wise. And I'll get into a little bit more of that wave 2. But this is the infomullet chart we do. It's a daily new cases per 100,000, and it's got the representative pandemic responses. So this chart shows these representative ones at more detail. It has more countries, you can look at it, but I picked the 4, and it's still pretty good. Germany, South Korea, Sweden, and the United States. And you can see here, wave 1, green is Germany, red is Sweden, blue is the US, and brown is South Korea. So you can see them laying on top of each other and how big a difference your pandemic response made. And both South Korea and Germany are what I would call having good responses with the hammer and the dance. Initially, you had a nice clean wave, a nice clean decline. Sweden and the US struggled. The US had an earlier peak, then fell into a trough, what I called wave 1.5, and it jumped up again. This was over the summer. Sweden rose high and then had a peak up very high and then dropped immediately. Now, I was getting hammered on YouTube by folks in Sweden saying, aha, we've solved it. Yeah, it was bad, but we now have our induced herd immunity. Well, here we are as wave 2 hits. So wave 2, the US has not dropped out of, Fauci was saying last night, we're still technically in wave 1, and you can see there's no trough formation. We don't hit a low at any point. It just goes down a little bit, then spikes up again. And I'm telling you, as a system scientist looking at this behavior pattern, this is very concerning because it's what we call an exploding oscillation. It's where it peaks, drops a little, and the next peak is higher than the previous peak. And the trough is higher than the previous trough. So what it shows is an accelerating dynamic, which seems to imply that the next peak of this wave that we're going through right now, whether you want to call it wave 1.5 or wave 1.75, I'm just going to call it wave 2 because it's happening with everyone else. It's going to probably be higher than our previous waves. And this is the season where this is the most impactful because it's in the winter on top of the flu season. This is why I'm saying, and I'm cynical, that everything that's happened to date in 2020 may be a footnote to what's about to happen over the next couple months, because this is really where we're going to get hammered with a flu season on top of this big wave in the fall, and we don't have any sort of control. But we're not alone. Germany's gotten hit by it. Sweden's gotten hit by it. Clearly, Sweden is not immune to this, as they claim, as they've shot up. But Germany has also had a rise in per capita. And you can see that rise here. Now, they do the hammer and the dance, so they're going back into lockdown. But when you look at the cumulative death rates, this shows the real difference between Sweden and Germany, right, in the approaches. First of all, Sweden, with its induced herd immunity, spiked up to a very high per capita mortality, but then has able to kept it fairly flat. It's still going up. This is not a flat line. It's still going up. But the U.S. crossed paths somewhere, month and a half ago when we crossed them. That's not a good, that's not a pat on the back of Sweden. It's just showing how bad the U.S. is. And we are in a league of our own an order of magnitude worse when you compare us to, say, Germany and South Korea. So even though the per capita cases show Germany's going up, I have more confidence in Germany for handling it than I do in Sweden, and certainly more confidence in Germany than I do in the US for where we're looking at. And this is the other part. So that was all mortality. Hospitalization remains a very real threat. And this is where there's a little bit of a silver ray of light. We saw that the deaths per capita were declining in each wave. It got a little bit less, not nothing, but a little bit less as we got better. This shows the hospitalization. Now, I'm not able to show this in the traditional infomullet style because the CDC, perhaps with White House thought leadership and vision, has prohibited me from downloading the data I used to download. So all I can do is kind of cut and paste their data, and I apologize, it's a messy chart. I used to break these into different, but what these charts are is their hospitalization rates by age group. So you see here in the right, the age demographic is from 4-year-old all the way up to 85. And it kind of follows that the lowest one is the 4-year-old, and then it goes up in the age. So though there's a lot of lines here, they kind of follow the age bracket. No younger age is crossing. But you can see that the cumulative rate over time of hospitalization per 100,000 has been growing, and it's not quite steadied out yet. It seems to be flattening, but it's not. Now, this is the cumulative over time. And just like that last chart showed the segments, this shows on the bottom part, this is the rate. So now this is the rate per 100,000 population per week. And what you see here is the hospitalizations per 100,000 were much higher in the earlier wave, and they have begun declining a little bit. Now the causes for that can be varied, but we've gotten better at making sure that the populations that are getting hospitalized are taken care of. Again, this is not nothing. I want to be very clear that even though we're getting better, it makes sense. You have a progress curve, a learning curve. We're getting better at treating the disease. We don't have a vaccine yet. Induced herd immunity is a joke. It doesn't work. So these just means that we're getting better at keeping people alive in hospitals. It doesn't mean it's safe by any stretch of the imagination. So let me pause here and go out and see if there are any questions at this point before I go into some of the global looks with the maps. And I think right now, by the way, those who guessed it was cynical, congratulations, you get 1 point. It's a 3-point contest. We'll see if anyone still has 3 points. So definitely cynical for the pandemic. Don't see any questions yet, and it's maybe loading slow. So I'll get to those in a second. But if we go out and look at this picture globally, so why am I negative, so cynical for what's coming up? Well, first thing, in the United States, we talk about this whole thing with the hammer and the dance. The reason we did the hammer was to put in place testing capability, contact tracing, and then you can go back to the dance, right? The whole purpose of the hammer isn't locked down forever. It's not living in fear forever. It's none of that nonsense that Corona clowns keep talking about. It's you put in place the capabilities so that you can reopen reasonably and have those capabilities to test enough people. And when you find them that are infected, you can trace and you can contain that. Well, that's the more people you have infected, obviously, the harder that is to do. It's one thing to trace a couple thousand people. It's another to try and trace 40,000, 60,000 a day. And we're approaching that now. But worse is the US remains completely unprepared for the pandemic. Here we are in October 21st, and the US from a testing and tracing standpoint is red across the board. And this is a map that I've shown before, the links in it. It's a state-by-state guide. It lists on 3 criteria. One, are they testing enough people that their positive rate is under 3%? The second criteria is, do they have enough contact tracers for the population? Again, ballpark number, 15 per 100,000 is a non-pandemic requirement. 30 per 100,000 is the guideline for contact tracers during a pandemic. And then they also look at the number of cases. So you can see here, if you hover over any state, you'll get that state's individual grade. Like look at Tennessee, it has the overall grade, its testing grade, its number of contact tracers. A lot of these states are failing if you hover over them. They're failing because they don't have enough contact tracers. So here we are with all this hubbub of this, that, and the other, oh, I don't want to do this anymore, I don't want to stay open, and states haven't even hired the contact tracers in a recession when people are out of work. The states haven't even made the basic measures to hire these contact tracers. And you can see if this is a preparedness, like, hey, if it would be really bad if a big infection hit the United States right now because we're completely unprepared for it. Then you look at this other dashboard, which is the Vienna Institute. I've shown this a few times, and it shows that we are being hit, in fact. So this is a worldwide chart with green, yellow, orange-ish, red, and you can see here it's the number of positive cases per 10,000 inhabitants within the last 14 days. The Vienna Institute of Complexity Science, green is less than 1 positive. That's what they say is not eradicated, but contained. Yellow is not contained. It's less than 10 cases tested positive. Red is they're considering it an outbreak. It's 10 positive tested cases per 10,000 people. Almost the entire United States right now is red or orange, depending on what your monitor tint is. Alaska, is, I think Hawaii's yellow. But you can see we're getting this outbreak at the time we're not prepared because we don't have the contact tracing. And Europe itself is also experiencing the second wave. Now you can see there are parts of, and I over here in Asia where the pandemic panopticon responses were put in place, Vietnam, it's a mainland. Everyone's like, well, Japan's an island, Australia's an island, New Zealand's an island, Vietnam's not an island, it's connected. South Korea's not an island. These things are connected to, large areas. China's not an island. They have done a much better job at containing the coronavirus than the Western countries have. Now, lest my friends in Sweden begin to feel that, haha, we're doing just as fine as everyone else, you can actually get some more data here if you break into the EU later, and it shows this is what that outbreak in Sweden is showing, and it shows there's certain, and these are where the big cities are in Sweden. You can see here where you have these large, I'm not going to pronounce that, Joplands, anyway, Stockholm's down here. You can see these large rises in testing, these huge spikes. And what's actually happened, this has just come out in the last 24 to 48 hours, is Sweden, drum roll, they are modifying their policy, kind of. They're finally going from, so Sweden has had what I would have called the induced herd immunity, although they don't like that. It's kind of what it is, which is a very, very limited guidance or regulation. Tell people to basically go about living their lives. We're going to try and protect the elderly, and from that we'll do okay. That failed abysmally, as I've talked about for months. But everyone in Sweden's like, well, we've now got the herd immunity, so we'll be fine. Well, the cases are rising there again, and just in the last 24 to 48 hours, a new guidance has come out. Now, it's a little confusing because they still call it the Swedish strategy. They're very much set on this, like, we were never wrong, and we're not going to admit we were wrong, except quietly. So they're still calling it the Swedish strategy. It's not the hammer and the dance. It looks more like the voluntary fire break. What it is Sweden is now advising to say, look, businesses should shut down if they want to. People should stay away from work if they don't feel well. You should be doing more social distance, but it's all guidance. I haven't seen. Now, maybe the regulations are supposed to come out Friday. We'll know more then. Maybe there'll be some bite or some teeth in that. But right now, it looks very much like the voluntary fire break that the U.S. tried in March. And I was originally a supporter of the voluntary fire break. That was my preferred method. It's like, hey, let's let the businesses that can shut down, that will put a fire break, but it's voluntary, right? Let each one determine their own. That didn't work at all in the US, and I don't think it's going to work all that much better for Sweden. I am glad to see that they're finally beginning to adjust to this because, they're just as vulnerable to the second wave as all the other countries in Europe are. So let me pause here and see if there are any questions of why I'm cynical. If I could put it in a nutshell, the US does not have the capability to trace or contain this pandemic. Likewise, there are enough reservoirs in the United States now that it can bounce around from region to region. We've seen this go from the Northeast or the coastal regions. It bounced then into the southern states. And then from there, it bounced in the Midwest states, and now it's bounced in the North Central. Some of the worst states right now, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, all of these corona clowns like, hey, we're in the rural hinterland, we're safe. No, they're getting hammered. And the reason why is because even if you're in a rural area, everyone still goes to that same one gas station, country carryout. They go to pick up their milk, their lottery ticket, their cigarettes, whatever. They chat up the folks while they're there. I mean, I get it. It's a small town. That's the gathering place. But if you have an asymptomatic person goes in there, they exhale, those particles go on the grocery store, the carryout. These places are not going to be cleaned every single time a customer comes in and out. And my guess is something like that. Not necessarily, people standing in the middle of their cow fields or their ranches or something, they're not in much danger, but it's where they come together and interact. That's where the transmission. And so you have, and that's a reservoir now. So you see this ping-ponging around of reservoirs means that the US cannot catch a break just by getting lax. So just as the coastal states are now getting tired with lockdowns and social distancing and masks, and after them, the South got its hammer over the summer, but now they're getting tired of it. Well, too bad. We didn't do what was necessary. We haven't put in the investment of contact tracing. The pandemic's not going to care how tired we are, and it's going to continue. It's got enough places now to bounce around to keep going unless we put in place very serious measures. I think we're going to continue to suffer from this. I think we're close to 220,000 dead at this point. And as to the US, so is as well, at least Europe. Europe has this mixed response between hammer and dance, which seems to be working pretty well, and this kind of, the United Kingdom mixing around and sort of debating. And so it's got places it can bounce around in there as well. And so that's one reason I'm cynical about wave 2 and what's coming up. Yeah, let's do some comments here. I'm seeing some now. Yeah, Ed's mentioning lower death rate. I am concerned that that's going to give us a false sense of security, the lower death rate, because what we've got coming up is the absolute worst conditions. So we're used to dealing with the coronavirus as a somewhat isolated. As it was peaking in the United States in March, April, the flu was declining. My concern now is what happens if the flu spikes at the same time we have one of these large coronavirus spikes. We may know technically what to do, but we're back to that flatten the curve in the hospital bed capacity, the ICU bed capacity. The flu always sends droves of people into the hospital, and it's not so much the mortality rate in a perfect world, then it's what's the mortality rate when you start running out of hospital beds. So I don't see any other questions, but again, I'm having a limited time of seeing questions, so hopefully I'm catching them. Let's jump into now from the economy. Did people make their guesses about whether I'm an optimist or cynical on the economy? So that I just told you what I was on coronavirus. Make your guesses on the economy, because this is the second part that I think people are really interested in is what's going on economically and how we're going to do. So place your bets. Drum roll. If you guess that I'm cynical about the economy after the presidential election, you'd be right. And it's this concept of, well, we need to help the economy, so we're going to do worse on the coronavirus, or we need to, the coronavirus can somehow be thought of separate from the economy. I'm trying to tell people, and I'm going to keep hammering this, they are linked together. As goes the coronavirus pandemic, so goes our economy. And as we go pear-shaped into wave 2 for the coronavirus, so too things are not looking great for the economy. Now they're better than they were, but a lot of that is government support that's kind of failing out, and there's no stimulus plan in sight. So let's jump to a quick check of some of the economic indicators that I've often used in the past. So let me set this up. First thing that everyone wants to know about when it comes to the economy is unemployment. And here we go. Hopefully this is showing. So this is all these charts come from Calculated Risk blog, and these are economic charts. If you want to track the recession that we're in and the depression we're likely to be in, Calculated Risk blog is the place to do it. It's where I get all my economic charts from. I'm not a paid endorser. I don't rank that yet. But what this chart shows is initial unemployment claims. And it goes back to 1971, and they've done a neat thing here is they basically track it over. They've also shaded these blue columns to indicate recessions. And he's done us the courtesy of marking us in a recession now. Very thoughtful there of Nate, Steve, what's his name? Nate's 538. It's I think it's Steve for calculator risk. But anyways, very thoughtful to shade us in a recession. And you can see here this massive spike. This was the initial unemployment claims from the first lockdowns and the withdrawal of the market from normal functioning that happened in March and April. And you say, wow, look, it's dropped so much. And they've put this little dotted line in here. And that's because, you know, normally these are tracked by year. It's been such a radical year that it's hard to see, but they wanted to show that the current rate of initial weekly unemployment claims is still at a higher point than at any point in the last 40 years, even under some of those worst recessions. You can see here the peak, and this 1,000 here, this is in millions. So this is 1 million people claiming unemployment in a week. And this is a 4-week moving average. So you can see during the Great Recession, we didn't quite get to 1 million people claiming unemployment. We're just slightly below that now. So even as much as it's come down in the last 6 months, we are still having more people claim unemployment and this trend than at any point over the last 40 years, including all the recessions. And then the second part of this is initial, is what is the continued unemployment claims? Continued means that they're claiming it week after week. And this is perhaps a more realistic measure of economic pain, because if I declare unemployed for a week and then I'm back on a job somewhere else, that's some churn. But what this is showing is that it's, again, same kind of chart, goes back to 1967, has a rolling average, and it shows the peaks and the recessions, and it shows that, again, we spiked up for continued unemployment claims. It's coming back down. It is coming down, but it still remains higher than at any previous point over the last 4 decades. And that's probably the really big thing, not the initial claims, but the continued. The continued unemployment claims remain very, very high. And there's a couple economic indicators I like to go over because people have asked about this. One of the things that's very different about this recession is it's really hitting state governments very hard, state and local governments. Traditionally, state, local, and federal governments have been recession-proof. I did a couple sections early on in the pandemic to say that states and local governments are very exposed to this pandemic. They're going to lose tax revenue. They're already overstretched. They have to pay out these massive unemployment claims. They don't have enough money. And I think this chart shows that impact. It shows a percent decline from the baseline over time. And so 0% is if our employment had stayed flat from February, that's what this top line is here across. If naturally you want to see a line that goes above it, that's positive employment. And the light blue is total non-farm payroll. And the dark blue is local government. This is very unusual. It's not often you see a local government decline like this and stay low. Normally in recessions, governments are fairly recession-proof, but this says there's been a lot of job cuts, not just in the private economy, but the public sector economy as well. And that's contributing to, I think, part of this wrangling in the Congress about the stimulus. You hear about states getting aid and you know, state aid, and they're like, well, why do states need it? I'm like, well, they're shedding jobs and they're being impacted by the pandemic. And we can see why, because the economic activity that underlines a lot of state revenue is also declining. Another question people had a big concern over was real estate and mortgage. You know, what is the percentage of people in forbearance over time? This is a sample of the major holders of mortgages. You got Ginnie Mae, Fannie, Freddie Mae, some other groups in the total. And it shows, this is from March 8th through October 11th, and the percentage of people that are in forbearance. Forbearance means we know you're delinquent, but it's okay. And it's a good leading indicator to say how big a problem is foreclosure is going to be. Well, it obviously spiked up quite a bit, but has dropped down gradually over time. So this is not a great news story because this means people are in pain, they're not able to pay their mortgages, but it's not as bad of an issue as it seems that people feared, the real estate issue. Now, there's been a lot of support structure underneath this to get us to this point. So whether that support structure continues or not is going to determine whether this continues to decline downwards from an economic standpoint or goes up. And a big part of the US economy is real estate. So if the mortgage, you know, the real estate market has a big problem in it, that creates a huge barrier to getting people back at work and things like that. It has a huge ripple effect. So this is an important number to watch. It looks pretty good, but it's not great. And as those unemployment claims stay high, obviously that's going to keep people in a forbearance issue. This is a general perspective on the economy. And what they did, it's kind of interesting, is they took Apple data of people asking for directions. So it's a proxy of people, and there's a few cities here. It's, you know, across the US, New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston. And what they're doing is they're using people going out asking for directions on their phone, they're mapping it. It's a proxy for movement outside the house. And this is a really good indicator of, you know, whether there's a legal lockdown or not, how much are people moving around relative to where they were in January. So the baseline here is January of 2020. That's where 100 is. 100 means 100% of the movement. And you see that there was some gradual increase of movement up until that lockdown phase happens, that disastrous week of March 14th, 15th that I've described, where just everything went sideways. And you can see the drop now. It has had some increases, but it seems to have flattened out at probably between 50 and 60% of normal. So that tells me that even though we don't have lockdowns, there's a large segment of the population that is still socially distancing, staying isolated. Part of this is contributed to schools shutting down. Parents have to stay home, take care of their kids. Part of it is to workplaces moving online, working remotely. You're not out going, you know, to your things. This is a proxy for the economy, but also the coronavirus response. And something that's a little more clear and interesting is the restaurant impact. And this is the year-on-year change in seated diners from online, phone, or walk-in reservations, 7-day average. You've got Texas, New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, California, the overall United States, and Illinois. And what you can see here, it's the same kind of chart. 0% is the baseline, no change. The floor drops out. 100% reduction in reservations, which means they're not open for business. And then you see these spikes. And I may do this for dialectic because it gets into a little thing. These spikes overlay that oscillating wave cycle I described. These spikes are actually predictors of when that next big spike occurs. And I'm not saying it's people going to restaurant are causing the spikes. I'm saying what's happening is there's an underlying dual causation that is driving both the spike in cases and the spike in restaurant. And what it is it's this fatigue of like, oh, it's no longer in our area. We just spent the last couple months being in a lockdown. We're going to go out. We're going to relax. We're going to take it easy. And then you see it gets hammered and people react by pulling back down. Then it goes on for a while, and then there's another spike. These spikes almost perfectly correlate with the wave 1, obviously, was the first drop. Wave 1.5 setting up there in mid-June, end of May to mid-June. And the wave that we're currently experiencing right now, this precedes it by a couple weeks. So you can use these economic measures. This is why I say these things are integral and tied together. It's almost a phase disequilibrium, which is a fancy way of saying you have wave cycles that are offset by time delays. And it looks like, there's a wave cycle of when do people start going out of their houses and relaxing their guard, then a time delay to a spike in positive cases, and another time delay into a spike in deaths. And we're going to see that pattern, and I think we're going to see that pattern play out here, where we're having this exploding oscillation. I don't want to get too much into systems thinking, but when I see these patterns, that's what I think of when I see it. So what does this mean for the overall economy? Oh, by the way, I had a bet, sidebar. I had a bet with John, gentleman John from On a Roll podcast, John Hughes. I bet him that there would be one or less cinema release of a Marvel movie in 2022. And that bet was actually made a year and a half ago. And I just want to point out, John, that the gross movie weekly sales looks like, at least for 2020 and 2021, that bet's not too far off. So not exactly the reason I thought it was going to be, so that may be partial credit. But if you go to his Facebook, he's got an event marked off in 2022, my prediction, to check on it. So John, I don't want you to think I've forgotten about it. So I'm feeling pretty good about that prediction right now. Hopefully I'll be wrong. Like most of my forecasts, I hope I'm wrong. But that's just a little interesting thing. Movie sales, clearly there's been a little uptick, but no one's going to the movies right now. Everyone's staying at home and watching at home. So the economy, again, if you guessed cynical, it's cynical is I'm cynical on the economy. So let me see here if there's any questions. While I'm waiting for the questions to load, like, follow, share the info mullet, share this video out, ask folks to like and follow it. I can use all that support. And if you haven't become a Patreon subscriber, it takes time to put these together. We have incurred some legal fees recently. We got to pay for the servers, for the hits and all that, that we're doing on the blog site. $5 a month. It really helps us out, and I know everyone's getting hit up with donations, but here's a way to donate without having to donate to one of those politicians. So www.patreon.com/infomullet. It's linked in one of the links there. You can go on, click there, $5 a month, $10 a month. We appreciate whatever you're able to do. So here's some questions or some comments. Some good parts. Ed's pointing out that masking also helps stop the flu spread. That's one thing I don't know. It's going to be interesting is how much of the social distancing and the masking and all that mitigates the impact of flu. It's a good question. I don't know. I'm not positive overall of the country's ability to maintain that just because we're not able to do it for the thing that's killing us. But hopefully it'll have some impact on the flu. Jerry's pointing out rent in Maine is way up. And someone else here, landlords in college towns absolutely getting crushed. I debated going into schools and colleges. I made that forecast that any college or university that opened and school would probably regret it and would probably have to go into a partial lockdown before the first semester for which the open is. It looks like a lot of them have had to do that. There's databases out there. I may do that after the election, but I wanted to focus here on what was, really important for the election. I think what Jerry's talking about is in Maine, a lot of places you're seeing a flight from the city with people who can. Obviously, this is a matter of means, but they're leaving the city because they're realizing I'm working from home. I don't need to be in a really expensive rent district to do that. I can work from home in a rural area or a far exurb that's outside the main area at a much cheaper cost of living. Now, sometimes they're double dipping. Like I said, this is often a case of means. They still have the place in the city, but they're renting a place out in the countryside, which is not at all dissimilar from the behavior of the Black Death when nobles who could got out of town and got distant. I think we're seeing some of that, but some of it I think is legitimately some companies, when we talk about the economy and the coronavirus, some companies have given guidance to their workers that said, we're not coming back in person till 2022, 2023. And I think this gives some stability within those companies for managers to take this seriously. I still hear of companies struggling with how to manage workers in the building and working remotely. And here we are, it's October. And I think those companies that are still struggling are, the management really has no excuse now. They've had plenty of time. It's different for colleges and universities, different circumstances, but for a for-profit company, get your act together, make it happen. And a lot of these companies have gotten ahead of the curve and just said, look, by saying that we're going to work remotely for 2022, 2023, they're telling their leadership and management, make right with this new normal. Stop pretending this is something we're going to be able to time or get around and just plan for it being that way. And I think that will help those companies do that. I know working with the DoD, they still do a lot of stuff remotely, and there's guidance going around as much as possible, embrace remote. Now, this is the DoD, which is like hostile to doing things online. They have security reasons. It's a military culture. Even they're pushing, get used to working remotely, get used to working online. Question from Ed is, do I plan to drill down on the COVID economy crash has hurt people by race, gender, locality? Yeah, I may do that after the election. That takes a lot more work to get the data, but it's certainly, as a general rule of thumb, things are unequal in the US of how they impact, and they generally follow the same inequalities, at least in terms of like ethnographic groups and races. A vulnerable population tends to suffer more under every circumstance. There's very few times that a vulnerable population will end up doing better than a privileged population. So you can kind of broadly say, look, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, these populations that traditionally have disparate outcomes are also going to have more disparate outcomes because of this. They tend to be in economic areas where there's less ability to work remotely. They tend to suffer more from those immediate, their work cycles are being more impacted directly as people shelter in place and do that. So it's definitely an unequal hit. Getting that by locality, you get into a fractal segmentation where you start doing race, gender, and locality, and that can take a lot of time to put together. So Ed, I'll take it as a request, but it may be, with the election coming up, it may be late November or December. Charles is pointing out that the rural areas are not ready for this migration out, and that the real estate is pricing out the local folks. If you go to Calculated Risk blog, right now, calculatorriskblog.net, and check it out. They have tons of information on this dynamic. If I knew this was going to be an interesting question, I could have pulled a lot more charts. They are looking at this question of real estate. They're looking at housing starts, real estate pricing. They have a lot of expert opinions, and they visualize all this data very well. So go check them out, and I think you'll be able to dig a little deeper in this topic than we're able to go on to here. So the final one of the big three, terrorism and national security. Do you think I'm cynical or optimistic as to what we're going to face in the domestic U.S. after the November 3rd election? So place your bets. I'll give you some time. Hopefully you've been thinking about it. While we're doing that, like, follow, share the video out. If you haven't liked or followed the InfoMullet page, please do that. Check out our YouTube. We've got a YouTube and Twitter channel. Also, if you haven't yet, www.patreon.com/InfoMullet, $5 a month for Mulleteers. Appreciate all the subscribers. So drum roll. For domestic terrorism, I am optimistic for after November 3rd. And I want to get into that a little bit more using a case study that has obviously been on people's minds. But my view on, and this is an area where I specialize in, and I'm talking here about mass instability, mass violence, I'm fairly optimistic that we're not going to have the worst case or even the near worst case that a lot of people are talking about after November 3rd. And it gets into this, for months now, I've been describing this difference between the threat from clandestine terror groups and what you might call the next up on the food chain is insurgencies. And the clandestine terror is, these are small networks of individuals they have to hide from the population as much as they have to hide from the authorities. And the difference of that between an insurgency, or, an insurgency, people like, well, we don't have insurgency here in the US. I'd argue we have, both in the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, and even after that, we've had insurgencies. But the difference than insurgencies, an insurgency has enough popular support that the insurgents don't have to hide from the population to the same extent they have to hide from the authorities. And I go into a lot of forecasts. In the 2020 Ask Me Anything, I went into a lot of forecasts about instability and what gives rise to instability and violence, mass violence. And, there's all these factors, but I want to talk today about this and use a case study. What's the difference? What's the threshold between terror groups have to remain clandestine and they can act as an insurgent? As a rule of thumb, I say about 17%, which means if you picked 100 people randomly within the population and you told 100 people that there was a group over there making bombs and they're going to bomb something, bomb a church, bomb a mosque, or do a shoot up a Walmart or anything like that. They found out that there was a group planning a mass violent event. If 17 people out of 100 won't turn that group into the authorities, they hear about it and either because they're scared, they're intimidated, or they support that group, whatever that reason is, if 17 out of 100 people, now you have conditions that are ripe for an insurgency. Because an insurgent, clandestine terror has to spend an enormous amount of time to hide from the authorities and the rest of the population. If you're an insurgent, you really just need to hide from the authorities. And we saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan all the time. You don't need to hide. I mean, the people in the area kind of know who the insurgents are, but they're either intimidated enough. And that threshold, it's a holistic number. This isn't like a heavily researched one, but I guess it's around 17%, 17 people out of 100. Below that threshold, you're probably still in the area where you're talking about small clandestine terror groups. Now, they can still cause harm, but when it comes to mass violence and mass instability, they're not, they're doing pinpricks as opposed to widespread devastation. And this example here, of the militia plot, the domestic terror plot to kidnap the Michigan governor, is a good case study to walk through as to where the threat I see post November 3rd. I don't see, and I'm going to go through my election forecast here in the last bit that people are interested on what my forecast is, but I don't see the same kind of risk after the election that there's going to be a civil war, or we're going to see IED bombs everywhere and the kind of campaigns and things like that. It's going to continue to be these sort of isolated shooting events with one or two participants. Now, they may seem fairly frequent because they're coming up on social media a lot, but we're talking the Kenosha shooting, 2 or 3 people killed, one's arrested. You have the Portland shooting, 1 person killed, 1 person then killed in an attempt to apprehend him. you know, the details of that I'm not going to get into because I don't do forensic scene analysis, but those are pinpoint interactions as opposed to, you know, by way of comparison, I was reading the other day, the FBI was investigating something like 1,800 bombings a year during the height of the violence associated with the civil rights movement, right? So I just want to think about 1,800 bombings a year at a population that's half the size it is now. The level of difference in violence is just, it's hard to fathom, and we can use charts and visualizations, but it's just hard for us to get our heads around how much less violent we are now than we were 30 or 40 years ago. And yeah, we may have a spike up, but that spike up is only taking us back to 2008, 2007, 2006, not times that people think back and say, wow, that was much like a civil war. No, it's just, it's moderately more violent. But this case in Michigan is interesting because it's the exact kind of group on the timeline that I've described. And I'm using the Department of Justice criminal complaint. There's a link to it in the below. And so I want to be clear, this is the government side of the story. We haven't heard their side of the story. I'm not exactly, I'll declare my bias up front. I'm not really favorable to the people who are alleged to have conspired to kidnap and kill a sitting governor, but to declare the bias, we are only hearing the government side of the story. But what they lay out is the exact scenario of that I fear from clandestine terror groups and on the timeline. So they actually get on the radar. This is interesting. They get on the radar in March of 2020, even before the lockdowns, even before the huge controversies of, you know, in Michigan where they stormed the state house and kind of, you know, demanded an end to the lockdown in April, before Trump said liberate. These folks were already on the radar, and they emerged from the Second Amendment groups. I mean, this is not the only path of emergence. There's a lot of acceleration pathways in the U.S. right now. You could talk white supremacy, Second Amendment groups, things like that, and other ones as well. But this one comes from Second Amendment groups. They're big on gun rights. And what they do is they begin discussing in March of 2020, and this is when they get brought to the awareness of the FBI. Now, what happens is as the lockdowns begin, this group, it's only about 8 people. They are not really, I mean, they're part of this constellation of groups and social media connections and things like that that are in this kind of general area, but they're not part of a 500-person militia or a large organized militia. One of the things that's really interesting, when you look at lone wolf events, you often find that they get rejected by the larger groups, because the larger groups kind of know which side of the bread their butter's on. They know how far they can push the status quo while also still getting money for t-shirts, caps, Facebook advertising. Maybe they got a Patreon too, or they're doing OnlyFans. I'm not going to judge, but you know, these large groups, they're generally money-making machines, and they realize if they run afoul of the FBI, they're going to stop making money. So they actually have a limiting effect. I mean, it's obviously tenuous, and you got things like Charlottesville where it all blows up. But generally speaking, the lone wolf actors are ones who get rejected from the main groups and then go off and form these small groups. This is a small group, 6 to 8 people. And what happens is in June, between March and June, they begin shifting from, you know, this kind of general, they're going to come take our guns, paranoia concern, to really accelerating on the coronavirus, the lockdowns, and the mask. And they begin focusing, they go from being, they were going to target police stations, they were looking at targeting government facilities, to they really begin focusing on Governor Whitmer, excuse me. And they have all these sort of pseudo commando fantasies. They've got these operational measures, like every time they have a meeting, they make them put their cell phones upstairs, and then they go down and they have anti-surveillance. This is one of the characteristics you see with these clandestine groups, is they tend to have this pseudo commando fantasy where they're imagining what the operators do, virtually no clue, but they're basically imitating what they think they see on TV, like don't turn your cell phone off because, you know, we don't want to be traced. Well, what they didn't realize, and is so often the case, the FBI was onto these folks way before they even thought about putting their cell phones, and they had, of the 8 people, 2 of them were FBI informants. So you talk about that threshold of like hiding out. Of the 8 people that were in this group, 2 of them were FBI informants, and they didn't know about each other. These are like 2 people who were independently went to the FBI and said, yeah, I'm really not comfortable with this going on right now, and became informants. So even as they're doing the, you know, putting their cell phone in the tinfoil wrapper and leaving it in the box, they have people who are basically wired by the FBI recording all these conversations. So we have a really good record of how this unfolds, and it's fascinating if you want to read it. But just at a high level, beginning in mid-June, they're focused more and more on the lockdowns. and they're focusing on Governor Whitmer. They do these training exercises. July through August is when they're doing trainings. They throw in all the military words like FTX, which is a field training exercise. They're doing all sorts of commando operator type stuff. They're doing reconnaissance. They're kind of amateurs about it. I mean, they're talking openly about kidnapping and killing a governor. This is an open conversation. But then they think they're going to be sly when they're on the phone by using code phrases like, baker and cake. They're clearly referring to explosives there. They're trying to find someone who can create a bomb, that they can use a bomb. And it's kind of like almost out of a movie. It's like, have you been able to contact the baker to buy the cake? I mean, they've just been talking about kidnapping the governor, and now they're going to talk about like birthday cake. This isn't, these code words are not very sophisticated. If I wanted to, I'm not doing that for any NSA listening in. If I'm going to be planning something nefarious, my code words are going to be like IEP or tax audit or standardized testing debate or something to do with Doctor Who. Any of those things that gets everyone to turn off and tune out and not pay attention anymore. That's what I'm going to pick to my code words. If I start using sly terms like, have you hired the baker to get the cake? It feels to me like they're wanting to get caught. And one of the things I talk about is, failure notoriety. I'm not saying these guys aren't dangerous. They went ahead and they couldn't get people to make IEDs, so they started creating a very crude IEDs using fireworks and shrapnel and pennies and stuff like that. They did reconnaissance on the governor's vacation manager. They did a reconnaissance during the day. They did the reconnaissance at night. They were operational. They were planning an attack before the November 3rd elections, and this is very well documented. So this is not that it's not that they're dangerous, but they're so amateur about it. And this is the difference of the threat. This is, I mean, if you think about it, that 17% threshold, 20%, 25% of their own people turn them in to the FBI. And when it comes to, mass insurgencies and stuff like that, this is something that needs to be known. And I'll get into a little bit when we get to the asymmetric communication, if we get into that bit, about what we can do with this information. But these are the kind of groups that scare me, because yeah, they can be amateur. They can afford to be wrong every time they do it but once. And it's that one time that actually causes an attack, causes an incident, causes someone to get hurt. And the FBI can't catch them all. So this is the concern I have, is not large groups rising up in the cities and having mass instability, but small, semi-functional, barely competent, getting lucky. Charles is asking, isn't that how most criminals get caught? They are dumb. I have a comment about the president of the United States, but I'm just going to leave it at that. Yeah, most criminals do get caught because they're dumb. Most people, and that's the thing is, when I go through the forecast, most Americans are not willing to spend time in jail for their beliefs yet. And that is a great suppressant on getting them out there and doing things which would get them caught. And that is not, I'm not saying they're ideological pure. I mean, we can see the survey polls, you can draw your own conclusions. There's a lot of nasty thoughts, but most people tend to like not being in jail more than they want to pursue whatever ideological thing they're saying they're really, yes. Ed's mentioning just do all your code words of HIPAA, then your completion conversation is wrong, they can't use it. So yeah, this is the kind of, so I'm optimistic, actually. I don't see, and this has to do with my election forecast, which I'm going to get into, is I don't see a huge risk of mass instability and violence after the election. I know everyone's concerned about civil wars or even insurgencies or things like that. I'm not seeing it. First of all, it's the winter, right? It's fall, winter. It's not comfortable outside. And second, the groups we're seeing are these small clandestine groups. Now, I said it would be 6 to 18 months that these groups would take to form, plan, operationalize, we're going to see. And here is an example of a group that is, from March of last year to October when they're caught, 8 months. And, you're going to see more of these. So we got to be prepared and still stay vigilant. But this is the risk coming up in at least the next 6 months, I think, is this kind of risk. And that leads into what is my forecast for the election results. By the way, if you want, so as not to spoil the election results, I'm going to do a forecast on what I see is going to happen, not from a standpoint of this person will definitively win, but what the first 2 weeks are going to look like after November 3rd, because that's when everyone's kind of nervous. So if you don't want it spoiled, I guess mute me, turn me off. If you do want to spoil it, like, share, and follow. Share it with all your friends. Spoil it for them. I'm fine with that. So let's first talk about November 3rd, Election Day. There's a lot of scenarios of electoral math, and you can go to 538 and see these. But generally, the clustering right now is Biden is favored to win. And where Biden wins, he tends to win by a lot. Where Trump wins, and there's I think right now 17 out of 100 scenarios Trump wins, he wins by a small margin. Now, all of these concerns, the concerns of the delay that would lead to instability, have to do with two general types. One of which is there's not a clear winner on election night, and it drags on, and people have nightmare memories of what went on with the 2000 recount in Florida, or some of these other primary recounts we've seen, where we've seen states in the primaries and other areas take weeks. Arizona had one where they were continually, I think Maricopa County, which is the main county in Florida, had to continually issue new results. Georgia, it's become an election night gag that it's like, okay, well, we're not going to know because these counties are delayed, and we got to wait days and days. So there's a concern that a inability to know who wins. And the three major states that are, lots of states are potentially delayed because some of them are complicating this year's this coronavirus. So you receive, when you can start counting the absentee ballots, some of these states don't allow you to start counting absentee ballots till the day of the election. And some states are allowing absentee ballots to be received after the day of the election. So you can see right there, if there's a large absentee ballot and you're only starting to count them the day of the election, that can add some time. But one of the things that's key here to keep in mind in this scenario, which is of how long it takes to know, is that there are the three major tipping point states. And a tipping point state is kind of a priori, hindsight is 2020 way. We often think like Trump won Florida, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and therefore he won the election. Well, that's only because those states were the last ones to report and provided the electoral votes that took him over the top. If those states had reported much earlier, but some reported later, we'd have a different thing. So these tipping point states, I'm a little uncomfortable with distinction, but generally it's considered right now Pennsylvania, Florida, and Wisconsin are the most likely, 30 to 40%, they're going to provide the winning votes. And I want to put finger air quotes about that. Of those two, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are likely to take longer to know. So if you get this scenario coming down where it's going to come down to these three states, and two of them are likely to take till the end of the week. So scenario one is we don't know who's won through the end of the week, right? It may be Friday before we have a count, and that's the scenario. The second scenario is that someone's not willing to accept the results. There's a clear victor, but someone's not willing to hand over power, and there's protests and riots and terrorism and stuff like that associated with one side or another not winning. Well, the first one I think is actually, here's how I see it playing out. If Biden wins, he's going to win by a lot. And if he wins by a lot, it's not going to be one or two states that determine the tipping point. And this is a forecast. I could be wrong. So save this, mark this, and laugh at me later if I'm wrong. If any big red state tips for Biden on the night of the election, Texas, something like that, Georgia, unexpectedly, Biden's going to win by a lot. And you're not going to need to wait for all the states because he's going to zoom past the 275 you need to be declared the victor. So the scenario I see is most likely is because the most likely scenario is Biden wins, and the most likely scenario that Biden wins is he wins by a lot. We're talking 200 electoral votes or something. In that case, you're going to know pretty early. And yeah, there may be some states hanging out, but you're already past the threshold, or the path is so obvious it's very clear that Biden's winning by a lot. If Trump's going to win, he's going to win by a narrow margin, is the forecast. That's just the forecast. So in that case, then you would be on, tooth and nails to say, wow, this one state that hasn't reported or is still struggling, that's the scenario where it's going to stretch out. Then the second scenario is people don't accept the results. Well, I go into this a lot in the forecast. Again, I think that 2 weeks after the election, I think it's going to be tense from Tuesday of the election till Friday of that week as all the states report. If it's a blowout, we're going to know by Wednesday or Thursday, and it will likely be over. If it still takes a little time, we'll probably know by Friday or Saturday. You may have protests, riots, gatherings, rallies, all that stuff will probably occur for that first week. Now, we've seen that. I mean, the good news, bad news is we're pretty experienced with riots and protests and gatherings at this point. We've seen it for the past 10 months or 8 months, so or at least since June. It feels, God, 2020 time. So in some ways, it'll be more of the same. It's going to be a continuation of what we've seen, but we've lived with what we've seen without breaking into civil war. So you're going to see that. I see it fading out over that second week. I don't see it lasting long. You know, weather's bad. If it's a blowout for Biden, there's not going to be a lot of support for it. I don't see a lot of this 2-week period. It's going to be that narrow, tense period from Tuesday through Friday, maybe through that weekend. You're going to see the riot. Obviously, the weekends are prime for riots and protests. People aren't working. They can go out late at night, stuff like that. I think by the end of the first week, you're going to have a downtick in that, and it's going to probably downplay. So at most, you're talking 2 weeks of activity. I don't see a lot of mass violence during that effect. Again, if someone's going to radicalize, because let's say Trump doesn't win, and they're going to take the MAGA cause into a violent actor phase, that they're going to operationalize, and it takes 6 to 18 months for them to get, and they're going to be subjected to just as much scrutiny as this group in Michigan. This doesn't mean that we aren't going to see clandestine terror efforts come out in, you know, mid-time next year. But if there's a very clear winner too, I've laid this out in another video. The choice of who gets to be president isn't really the president's at a certain point in time. The Electoral College meets, they vote. If you don't have your votes in by then, too bad, you're out of luck. Once they vote, if they can't decide, it goes to Congress. You know, the president of the United States is surrounded by Secret Service personnel who don't really like him right now. They're not really pleased with him getting sick and getting them sick and exposed. You know, and I'm not saying Trump would do this. I think he's bluster. I've never seen him sustain a threat against personal risk, but you know, he's kind of the loud bully who likes to talk big but then back down. Let's say hypothetical that he refuses to hand over power after it's very clear and says, I still won the election. I think it's very likely he'll be arrested about 35 seconds, whenever the deadline is that he needs to hand over power or do something, and he doesn't. I think the Secret Service are going to look forward to arresting him. That's probably a wild hair prediction, but that's kind of what I'm saying. Now, if Biden loses, right, because there's still, remember, forecast is 17 times out of 100, Trump's wins. He's out there, he's doing his rallies. His rallies were what made the difference last time. I see a lot of protests and riots, but I don't see mass uprising and immediate civil war. I just don't see it. Now, that doesn't mean there might not be clandestine terror groups on the left that form up. Some of them are probably already forming as we speak, having been radicalized over the summer. We're going to still see those play out. We're going to see them come out. But again, it's the difference between clandestine terror networks and mass insurgency is that 17% of the population. And if you haven't crossed that threshold, you're going to end up like these folks in Michigan, where they end up you're going to end up in that situation where people inside your own group are informing on you to the FBI. Jan Soitino saying he's already said he would flee to another country. By the way, you heard it here first. If Trump does leave the country, my bet's on Turkey. I know that's not a favorite. People are thinking Russia or Monaco or something like that. I'm calling it Turkey right now. He's got a good relationship with President Erdogan. Erdogan, you know, their extradition agreements are subject to the whim of Erdogan right now, and I think he goes to Turkey. I don't think he goes to Saudi Arabia or one of the Gulf community cooperation states, just because those states rely on the U.S. so heavily that there's a really big lever the U.S. can use to get him extradited. But I think if Trump flees the country, it's going to be to Turkey. So, but I don't think he's going to flee. I think he's going to stay and try and get a TV slot. I think he's trying to figure out how to cash in after this. If he loses, he still could win. So that's where we're at right now. Let's talk about how you can be effective after the election, right? This concept of asymmetric communication tactics for after the election. A lot of people, when they're dealing with these asymmetric things, you see them out there, their intentions are good, their heart's in the right place, but they have no idea how to deal with an asymmetric communication space and be effective. And so I actually wanted to talk really briefly, because we're a little bit over the top of the hour. I'll keep it short here. There's two tactics that I've talked about already. And in fact, there's an article that goes over this in depth, but there's some good examples. And it's called failure notoriety and counter-reification. And the first one, failure notoriety, is when you see this group like this Michigan group, what I saw on social media is that this grab-ass bunch of clowns who wanted to do this and were so inept that they'd gotten penetrated by the FBI and were being watched and monitored the whole time and were basically playing pseudo-commando. I'm not saying they're innocent. They're guilty, as from what it appears from the evidence. They're guilty. They should go to jail. It's terrorism, no doubt. But when I see everyone treat this small group as the imminent vision of civil war, I just shake my head and like, no, don't do that, because what these people thrive on is the fantasy of power. They want to believe they're the Dark Panther of the night, sleek edgelord militia that's going to cause a civil war. And when they see social media erupt in people being terrified and fearful and expressing fear and doing all that, I get it. Fear is valid, but you have to also balance when's the place you want to show your fear, how do you want to demonstrate your fear, and do you want to be smart in how you do it and not play to their playbook. Failure notoriety is the opposite. Failure notoriety is saying, these guys were a bunch of idiots. Look at how stupid they were. No one likes, it's really hard to be an edgelord when people are pointing at you and laughing. And that is, it harms these groups. If they take away the mystique and the mystery and the, you treat them, it's kind of like Charlie Chaplin and Hitler. You treat them as an object of ridicule. That's a very different psychological dynamic. And if it spreads over social media, that has a dampening effect because people want to be cool. If you're a normal person, you want to be cool and you post up, I want to be like these Marvel superheroes or something like that. If you're a domestic terrorist, you dream of starting a civil war and making people scared and getting them fearful. Well, if you see that reaction come out, then you think, well, maybe I can get some of that. So failure notoriety is the mass publication, both by media and by individuals, of ridicule, amusement, point out the flaws and stuff like that. It also spreads the word that this is very hard to pull off. If I think that anytime I'm going to plot domestic terror, the FBI is going to be inside my group with at least 2 to 3 confidential informants, fancy tech, and I don't have a chance, I'm going to be a little bit more reluctant to go down that road. So failure notoriety serves 2 purposes. One, it's a psychological damper on the cool effect or the mystique effect. These pseudo commandos, they're living out a fantasy. Failure notoriety dampens the fantasy, but it also spreads the deterrence of, you're going to get caught. You're not going to be successful at this. You're going to become a laughing stock. Don't do it. And that's a deterrence. That's one type of effective asymmetric communication that, after the November election might be pretty good to point out. There's certainly on if we were thinking of where could we point out the failures of different groups leading up to this election, I think you could do that. Won't get into that too much because I want to get to the second. The second concept is a term called counter-reification. And I originally brought this up way, pre-pandemic. I'd already done my first coronavirus article, but I had a big article and it was about the OK hand sign and white supremacy. And I said, canceling this hand sign is the wrong approach. And the links are in to this article are in there, but we've actually had a really good case study because what I talk about in that article is something called counter-reification. And with the Proud Boy movements, if you've watched it all on social media, there's been this case study of the Proud Boys, and it's an example of counter-reification. So if you want to open the article now, you can read it. It's up on the info mullet. It was using the OK hand sign of white supremacy as the case study, but it described, and it gets into a lot of details in asymmetric communication, but it describes this counter-reification tactic that we've now seen used extremely successfully. And what it looks like is, and these are some graphics from the article, but reification, first thing, think about, and reification, and the term I'm using it, is how concrete is an idea. If I play for you the soundtrack of Darth Vader, the Imperial March, 100% of the people who hear that are going to think in their head Darth Vader. That's a highly reified idea. That idea means the same thing to all people. If I played some random collection of keys that I just type out and it's a random song, everyone's going to have different impressions of what that means. That's a low reification. Reification does with this concept of coherence. How strong is an idea in the minds of everyone to mean one thing? Low reification means one idea can mean many things. High reification is one idea means only one thing to lots of people. And this concept of the OK hand sign being a symbol for white supremacy, and it goes into the history of this and how it starts as a prank and then crossed over to the real world and all this back and forth. That's in the article. But what I did is I tried to describe the populations that were in this asymmetric contest of communication. And on the left were activists who were concerned about the use of OK to signal white power. Now, for sake of this discussion, operate on the premise that it's a legitimate concern. I think it was a legitimate concern. You can debate later, but for the sake of this discussion with asymmetric communication, the premise is this is a legitimate concern that OK is being used as a hand sign for white power. Small group of activists, they believe this. Over on the right, is the trolls and racists using OK to signal white power. So here you have your two groups that are in conflict, in a narrative conflict. But in the middle, I call them the civilians, the vast majority who have no clue or understand that OK isn't as it's always been. And this is the problem with the, OK hand sign has been reified to mean things like I'm OK for safety when you're scuba diving. I'm doing OK is just a, casual gesture. It means it's not, well, the reification of the hand sign as a means of white supremacy is very, very low. And what I was seeing is people say, well, what should we do in reaction to this? Well, we should fight this and we should cancel the use of OK and attack people who are using it because they're probably white supremacists. And that leads to this problem that comes up when you surrender the ground. And there's things in the article about when you should or shouldn't do it. But if you have a low reified idea and you surrender that ground and then try and attack it as a bad idea, what you've done is you've shifted the civilian population right up against the trolls and the racists. And what happens is you see the activists here, they're using their energy for coercion to educate and cancel, which I mean is like they go out and they say, you shouldn't use that, or let me tell you that that's a racist symbol and here's why. They've got to punch through all these civilians that are in the way, this huge buffer. On the far side are the trolls and racists who are laughing because they don't have to spend much energy at all. And they've made the activists punch through this huge block to get to them. And the article goes more into this, but what it means to the activists, and when you're doing this, and they say you're fighting the forces, not their strategy. Their strategy is to make OK a legitimate hand sign for white supremacy, right? You're not fighting that. You're fighting their forces. You're fighting everyone using the hand sign, and that's getting you this bumper. It's very energy intensive, and then energy is aimed at the civilians. These people don't understand what's going on, but you attack them or you try and educate them and they get confused and there's backlash, and now all of a sudden, you're losing them out on the narrative discussion. The trolls and the racists, on the other hand, they exploit Parkinson's law through expansion. This gets technical, it's all in there, but basically means problems expand to the space you give them. When you surrender that ground, the problem won't politely thank you and cease there, it will expand to take further. It co-opts the existing legitimacy of OK, and the energy comes from the civilians. So it's in this scenario where you're trying to cancel or attack people for using OK, not a good strategy because you're letting the trolls and the racists be very energy conserved while you're spending the most. Conversely, counter-reification is where you diffuse an idea to mean many things. Reification, one idea means one thing. Counter-reification is you make it so the idea means many things. So this is what it looks like when you do a counter-reification strategy. A counter-reification is where you say, OK means it's safe, we're doing OK, but also make it, I even describe it, make it a hand sign for support for LGBTQ causes, make it a symbol for pony boy, all the stuff that you could find in Rule 34, make it a symbol for all sorts of causes that the trolls and the racists would not want to be associated with. What that does is that brings the civilians to your side. Civilians don't care if OK means many things because it currently means many things anyways. They can tolerate that, but the trolls and racists who want it to mean one thing, white supremacy, they can't tolerate it that it's being used as a symbol for support for LGBTQ. And so down here, you flip that energy dynamic in the asymmetric context. You've now made it very light energy, and you focus your attacks on the trolls and the racist because the civilians are on your side. Now the trolls and the racists, to get that it means only white supremacy, they got to convince all the civilians who are like, I'm fine with it meaning many things, I don't concern. And so the energy drain is now coming from the right side of this equation. And this was somewhat theoretical when I posted it. I used examples in the past of how ethnographic groups have actually been able to reclaim very reified terms like the N-word and things like that, where they've been able to reclaim that term and give it meaning to themselves that didn't mean its original meaning. But that was somewhat historical. With the Proud Boys, so what happened is in the debate, Trump's asked if he wants to, condemn white supremacy groups. He tells the Proud Boys to stand to and stand by or something like that. Very bad choice of wording. If you've ever been involved in the military, stand by literally means wait for further instructions. Like, stand by for order, stand by, more to follow, stand by and stand ready. All that stuff implies that there's more instructions coming. And he basically seemed to imply an endorsement for the Proud Boys. Well, what happened after that is a lot of gay activists began claiming the Proud Boy hashtag as a symbol of gay power. This caused a huge problem for the white supremacists that don't want to be associated with Proud Boys. What happened is they took something that had been very heavily reified to mean one thing. Proud Boys meant, you know, a white supremacy group, you know, further than alt-right, highly nationalist, chauvinistic, Western culture values. It meant all this manly, or, you know, traditional Nietzschean kind of stuff. Which generally isn't really truly Nietzsche. It's the German interpretation of Nietzsche that's found in the Third Reich, but that's a separate topic together. What the gay activists did, though, is by claiming the Proud Boys hashtags, they counter-reified. Now Proud Boys meant all sorts of stuff that those folks were not comfortable with. And you've actually seen this coming over from overseas with the Magna and the J-pop fans that have been doing this, the Japanese that are the most prolific social media users at all, they've attacked some of these hashtags by bringing in Japanese culture. And these counter-reifications are very effective. It's a asymmetric way of diffusing. So in the first case, I was saying, don't try and surrender on okay, fight back at it and do it in this way. Here is examples of counter-reifying something that was fairly well reified and breaking it apart to mean many things and losing that cool factor. It ties into failure notoriety as well. It loses for what cool means for this group. They don't want to be associated with something they think of as uncool, so it's attacking it where it hurts. And this is an example of a very energy effective way to counter-reify the meanings. And again, the article goes into this a lot more. It talks about when you should and when you shouldn't. How would you know the difference? Korean, yeah, I'm being corrected. Oh, wow, there's a lot of comments here, Sal. So let me go catch up some of this. Jerry's correcting me. It was the Stans are Korean K-pop fans, not Japanese. My apologies. Surprising no one, my cultural familiarity with J-pop versus K-pop, not great. Not really my wheelhouse, so missed that. Yeah, Jay Peterson mentioned, I doubt there's a far-right conspiracy bigger than a bowling team without an FBI informant among them. It's not like the FBI is hunting for 40-ish whitish dudes. Yeah, or hurting, yeah. Yeah, if the FBI needs a 40-ish whitish dude to go be an undercover informant, you know, it's a little bit easy to find. And Jay points out that the Bundys, which was the Maller wildlife refugee, they actually had more informants than conspirators. And that's the failure notoriety you need to advertise. You need to advertise, if you got a group of 8 people, 6 of those people are on the payroll of the FBI. And if you're not getting yours, you're the one who's going to end up in jail. If you're not getting the paycheck. Yeah, people are saying it was funny to watch on Twitter. So again, the article's in there. I'll clip the article. It's on the Infomol. It's a very long article. It goes through all the more technical details of why this is and the system dynamics of it. But if you're looking for, you know, November 3rd is going to be hard no matter which side you're on. There's going to be things. I'm going to say if you're looking for effective asymmetric communication things, don't go out and play to the opponent's playbook. Be smart about it. Take your narrative framework and tactically think about what strategy am I trying to pursue? Is it pursued by advertising failure notoriety of the other side that's losing, or these examples of failure? Is it better pursued by counter-reification? You know, one of my challenges with OK is that we shouldn't surrender the ground before the hard fight is ended. Why are we giving up territory without fighting for it? A lot of these things are worth fighting for, and some of them are worth fighting to reclaim. So I wanted to pause here because it's getting toward 2:30. Last pitch, if you haven't checked it out yet, all this stuff takes a lot of time to put together. That OK to cancel article probably took a month to put together. And all the Patreons who support this and make that kind of content possible, we're doing kind of a series right now on misconduct and volunteer organization. That stuff takes money. It takes time, it takes money, it takes legal fees, things like that. If you become a Patreon mulleteer, $5 a month, www.patreon.com/infomullet. It helps pay for the servers, which are now getting hit with the COVID checks and the metrics and all that. So take a look, become a Patreon if you can. We're thinking about adding a Patreon tier that will let you ask a forecast question for the New Year's Eve Ask Me Anything forecast. We'll probably have the details of that coming up. Again, in review, this is the last Ask Me Anything before the presidential election. The top 3 issues that are no surprise, people worried about the economy, they're worried about the coronavirus. I think those are linked. I'm cynical about those. I think regardless of who wins, it's going to be bad days ahead, and it's going to take a lot of time to recover for both the coronavirus and the economy post November 3rd. This third biggest thing, national security and terrorism, I'm actually kind of optimistic when it comes to terrorism, mass insurgency, and mass violence. I don't think it's going to be as bad as people say it is. I don't think we're going to end up in civil war and insurgency. We definitely have to keep an eye on these clandestine terror groups. But if you get in that situation where it's come November 3rd and you're in one of these scenarios where, like, I don't know what's going on, how should I react? Think about how you want to fight their strategy and not their forces. Think about how you want to use, because we're all, media broadcasters in one way or another at this point. Think about how you want to use that. And if you have any questions, use the info mullet, right? Share my stuff. I'm fine getting death threats. It happens once a week or so. So, just be smart out there. As always, I appreciate everyone tuning in. I hope it was a good time. Again, go out and vote. If you haven't vote by mail, vote in person. Vote once, don't vote often. That's bad advice. When you go out, wear a mask if you can, practice the social distancing, and hopefully we can, mitigate the worst of this. But appreciate all your support, and everyone be safe. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the Info Mullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the Info Mullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.